It's hard to believe that in 2024, a game publishing giant like Ubisoft could ever conceivably face a downturn so severe that it would bring existential consequences to it. What was once a critical and commercial darling of the AAA games industry is now, in 2024, after a string of high budget games which faced disappointing sales, on the brink of collapse. Worse still is the state of its public relations, which, despite the company's impending failure, continues to antagonize those who once supported it. We seem to live in an age where no large game developer is safe from these kinds of controversies. But Ubisoft in particular has been a mainstay in the industry for so long and has contributed so many of gaming's most iconic franchises. This instance feels like a blow much deeper to the industry than in most other cases. While I personally never actively followed Ubisoft's name, especially when deciding on games to buy, there was one game by Ubisoft I played that incidentally became one of my favorite games of all time. Far Cry 2 was released in 2008 by Ubisoft as the sequel to Crytek's groundbreaking 2004 game Far Cry. Far Cry was known for being one of the biggest boundary-pushing games of its generation on a technical level, and has aged surprisingly well on PC after 2 decades. Far Cry 2, while well received by critics and audiences alike, finds itself overshadowed by its sequels, especially the phenomenon that was Far Cry 3. But there was something special about Far Cry 2. My aim for this isn't to argue that Far Cry 2 is one of the best games ever made, or it is better than the other games in the series. Instead, I want to explore what made the game so irresistible to me that it became one of my favorite games. I also want to see if Far Cry 2 still holds up after not having played through it in so long. Does it still deserve that spot as one of my favorite games of all time after the initial nostalgia wears off? I would first like to give my background for gaming so that my perspective of where I was coming from when I first experienced Far Cry 2 makes sense. During the 7th console generation, my experience at home was exclusively on the Nintendo Wii. This turned out to be based on pure luck, as it turned out. The only reason we got a Wii was because it was fully backwards compatible with Nintendo GameCube games, and since we had 2 GameCubes that had both given up reading discs, it ended up being the only real bargaining chip for getting a Wii. Coming from an already lower-class family directly affected by the subprime mortgage bubble of the mid-2000s, it was already a difficult case to make in favor of upgrading from the GameCube to the Wii, despite how cheap the Wii was. This was compounded by the fact that the concept of upgrading electronics after every few years was, and still is, impossible for my mom to understand. It might sound weird to those of us who are into gaming or electronics in general, really, but to her, a Nintendo was a Nintendo, 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 was a Nintendo. The only thing keeping an NES from being able to play Nintendo Switch games is corporate greed, I think. I actually don't know, but that's my guess at least. Suffice it to say, even getting a Wii was kind of a miracle, but that was at least my entry into the 7th generation of consoles. The Wii, as everyone knows, had certain technological limitations that prevented a lot of bigger AAA games from being ported to it. Games like Grand Theft Auto 4 were games I could only enjoy at my friend's house on his PlayStation 3, but I was happy with what I had. I would eventually get a laptop computer that could run GTA 4 anyway, so I guess I would be able to get my GTA fix in the meantime. When I would finally end up getting a used Xbox 360 in 2016, I would end up getting a bunch of used games with it cheaply as part of a deal GameStop was offering at the time. I can't remember what kind of deal it was, but I ended up getting a bunch of games including Sonic 06, Sonic Generations, a Dreamcast compilation disc, Halo 3, Halo 4, Duke Nukem Forever, and Far Cry 2. I was especially drawn to Far Cry 2 because I was pretty sure that I had seen gameplay from the game used in one of Review Tech USA's videos, a channel I watched a lot when I was in high school years earlier. The idea of an open world, first-person shooter survival game was incredibly interesting to me, and since the game looked a lot like what I remembered seeing in Review Tech's videos, I took the chance and picked it up. Once I tried the game, it really blew my mind. The opening cinematic was really interesting and laid out the background you were falling into. You got to choose your character from a surprisingly large roster. These characters all had interesting backgrounds themselves, and while these protagonists aren't as memorable as other Far Cry characters, it did help set the tone for the game with what you might expect with this misadventure. Somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, a country is on the brink of civil war. The tensions between the two different factions, the UFLL and the APR, are hitting a boiling point. The powder keg is about to blow, and there are certain profiteers who see nothing but the potential for fortunes that can be made. Your character is hired to take out the biggest of them, the one governments have been hunting for forever, the Jackal. You are a highly experienced hitman. You've served in some capacity in recent conflicts, and you know your way around wars, and should have no problem taking out one single target. But then you get malaria, and your assassination attempt is subsequently thwarted. The Jackal mocks you, but instead of killing you, he leaves you a machete and a pistol to defend yourself with once everything blows. He knows you won't kill him because he tells you that he can't be killed. You go unconscious again due to your illness and wake up again, later to the sounds of gunfire and grenades. The war has started. Thanks to your need for medicine to keep your malaria at bay, you find yourself an unwilling participant in this civil war as an unaffiliated hitman. You end up working both sides of the conflict whilst gathering useful information about the Jackal so that you can ultimately find and kill him once and for all. My initial reaction to this game could only be described as overwhelming. Far Cry 2's graphics were something I had never seen before. Yes, I'd seen games like Halo 3 and Halo 4, The Last of Us, etc., but Far Cry 2 just seemed different. At a time where games like Grand Theft Auto 5 only offered a first-person perspective for the PC version thanks to the console hardware not having the grunt to support such a feature, seeing a first-person open-world game like Far Cry 2 on a previous generation console was mind-blowing. The attention to detail the game had was amazing. If you drove a truck to a bus stop, used the bus to fast travel to another area of the map to do a mission, and fast travel back to the bus stop you left from, your truck would still be exactly where you left it. What? I was so used to other games where something like that would just result in the truck despawning. I don't know, maybe that's just an easy thing to do, but that was so cool. There was variable weather, a 24-hour time cycle, dynamic fire spreading, physics on almost every object in the game, on a huge, truly open world map. Even the concept of being able to drive the cars and trucks in first person added a level of immersion that I was so hungry for at the time. The fact that this was a survival game, where it was you in the middle of the African wilderness, which was also a war zone, crawling with militia, which will open fire on you the moment they see you, was thrilling. Your weapons will degrade over time and will jam and eventually become unusable if you don't replace them. If your vehicle becomes disabled, you can go and repair the car to keep it running, but even prolonged use of the cars will lead to their inevitable degradation. Driving them through water slightly too deep can kill the engine. Boats behave the same too. Even the bigger boats, you still run the risk of running aground than taking a smaller boat. There is even a way to quickly switch between the driver's seat to the gun attachment on the beds of the trucks. Ubisoft, they literally thought of everything, and if your vehicles are destroyed or rendered useless and you're far from civilization, you have to brave these harsh lands entirely on your own, with only what you are carrying. Maybe you're decked out with a fully locked and loaded and armory of weapons and ready to take on any militia outpost or patrol that could come your way. Or maybe you're running low on ammo. You have a gun that degraded to the point of misfiring and destroying itself in your previous encounter. Your primary weapon is low and the only defense you have now are a couple of frag grenades and Molotov cocktails. Or maybe you only have your machete and you're forced to sneak slowly on the fringes, ducking into brush and grasses at every sound that could feasibly be construed as the sound of tires on a dirt road, squeaky brakes, or an engine. Sometimes it's just an animal, a buffalo, zebra, or antelope. Maybe it was just a gust of wind or rain beginning to fall. There's a fleeting relief that comes from that realization. But when it is a patrol, the moment they come into view, you catch yourself hoping against all hope that they don't see you. And it feels like it takes forever for them to get out of view and earshot. They seem to loiter as if to tease you, knowing that you are there, egging you on to try and take them on. After all, if you do take these guys on, you can take their vehicle for that added sense of security. Will you? Or will you not try your luck? This is the kind of tension I lived for in a game, and moments like this delivered it in spades. There's a lot of driving in Far Cry 2, and many people don't like that about this game. Ubisoft would eventually be lambasted for this kind of massive open world traversal design and be accused of using it to pad out playtime, making the game feel more substantial than it really is, but I really don't get that sense with Far Cry 2. The environments are surprisingly varied and have more to do in them than meets the eye. There are 221 briefcases hidden throughout the 2 maps you will explore. Finding these is probably the ultimate scavenger hunt in any game I've yet experienced. You also have the option to scout out all 57 militia outposts, which can require combat scenarios which can vary wildly based on the outpost layout, the terrain, and the armament of the militia manning it. You can also participate in side quests, running hits on targets of opportunity, or taking out rival weapons suppliers for your friendly gun shop owner to unlock new guns, upgrades, and skills. Doing these things can add so much to the playtime of the game, and while yes, all of these things will require you to traverse the savannas, jungles, and deserts of the diverse African wilderness, and some of the side quests sending you to complete opposite sides of the map, at least you know that your journey to your destination will probably not be an uneventful one, and that once you get there and accomplish your mission, you can come away with the satisfaction that you survived another day, or however long it took you to accomplish your mission. The combat in Far Cry 2 is very closely tethered to its survival element. You have regenerating health, but in a very limited capacity. You have several bars of health, of which only the last 2 can regenerate by themselves. In order to heal fully, you must use syrettes of morphine. If your health drops to near depletion of your last bar of health, you are given a limited time to find cover, as it slowly depletes automatically to mend your potentially mortal wounds so that you can recover and return to the fight. Your weapon loadout can also fundamentally change the way you approach combat scenarios, and depending on the mission you're on, you have to consider carefully which weapons to arm yourself with to accomplish it in the best way possible. You can carry 3 weapons at a time, plus your trusty machete. You have a primary weapon, a secondary weapon, and a special weapon, all mapped to the D-pad on the controller, a very intuitive idea. The more weapons you unlock and buy, the greater the variety of ways you can mix and match them for your combat encounters. In the first half of the game, I would arm myself with a sniper rifle of any kind, a light machine gun, and IEDs. Later, I would trade the sniper in for a silenced MP5, with the dart rifle and the China Lake grenade launcher for crowd control. I like to refer to that one as my portable artillery when I was in a pinch. I would also later in the game experiment with guns like the MAC-10 as my close-range replacement for the MP5, trading in the latter for the ridiculous semi-automatic grenade launcher, which can fire 4 grenades before reloading. Insane. There's also the gun I like to call the America gun because of its name starting with USA. This has a drum magazine that doesn't hold many rounds but holds powerful, high caliber rounds that can drop enemies after 1 or 2 body shots. But by game's end, I opted for my most preferred loadout, the AR-16, the SAW machine gun, and, once again, my trusty China Lake grenade launcher. Love that thing. The AR-16 had the benefits of an assault rifle with a scope similar enough to a sniper rifle that it could fit those roles simultaneously. The SAW carried a ridiculous amount of ammo, it did a lot of damage, and could put a ton of lead downrange in a short time, and the China Lake was the perfect crowd control, close-range artillery. Love that thing. Each weapon has their own characteristics that balance them from one another, and that makes the decision-making process on which ones to equip yourself with is crucial for your success. The dart rifle is silent and a one-hit kill weapon, but its reliability isn't very great and it only carries 5 rounds. Meanwhile, the Springfield 1903 is more reliable, is just as accurate, carries more ammo, but can't typically take out enemies in 1 hit. The MP5 is silenced, but it eats through ammo as fast as the MAC-10, does less damage, and isn't as accurate as the AR-16. I could go on, but the point is that how combat scenarios play out can sometimes be determined on what you choose to arm yourself with. And this not only adds a level of strategy to the game, but also creates a lot of potential for replayability. You could go through the whole game and only focus on the main story if you so choose. But even then, you will find yourself carrying out various missions on behalf of the various factions of people who exist in the game. A lot of the time, you don't have much of a choice, but sometimes you are presented with a choice that can have some effect on some of the game's mechanics. Although, looking back, it might not be as profound as Ubisoft want us to believe. Malaria is ever present in this game. You will consistently be hit with a malaria attack, which you stave off using medication. The problem is that you periodically run out of medication and you have no choice but to work for a guy who serves as a middleman, helping to bring refugees travel papers so that you can escape their crumbling country. The medication is something that doesn't run out randomly, but instead runs out to push certain plot points further. At first, one might think that this mechanic is pace-breaking, and I guess I can kind of see where those people are coming from. It's not like refusing to go on missions to get the medication is an option. If you let the malaria go untreated for long enough, you will die and have to restart from your last save, effectively serving as a roadblock to your progress. But this all makes sense in the grand scheme of the larger story at hand. If you know the game's ending, you know what I mean. Maybe. You're working for these factions, the UFLL and the APR and the Resistance group of mercenaries who wish to see both organizations fail, but there is also the side of the regular people who are affected by this conflict. These refugees are seeking to escape this place. Their homes have been destroyed and their lives forever changed by a conflict between two organizations who are so preoccupied with their own interests in filling the power vacuum left behind by the country's former monarch that any civilian lost in the crossfire is simply collateral damage. The malaria mechanic, then, is a means for the game's narrative to remind you that the real victims in all of this are the refugees. It forces you to help them, as it is your only means at getting the medication you need to stay alive. You have to hand deliver them their travel papers, seeing them with your own eyes and the desolation this war has brought to them. It adds a very real human aspect to a game which is otherwise all about playing the political intrigue between two warring factions and working with a group of mercenaries to sabotage them in ways reminiscent of action thriller movies. There's a realism to this since these sorts of things still happen to this very day, and even though this is all fiction, its broader scope doesn't seem entirely far-fetched. The main story itself centers around trying to find the Jackal. He is a mysterious and seemingly unkillable arms dealer who pops up wherever a war is about to break out to supply the weapons needed to wage that war. You're being sent there to kill him, and you're led to believe that he is a villain. As the story progresses, however, a greater nuance begins to emerge. What might have first seemed morally cut and dry grows muddier as you collect tape recordings of a journalist interviewing the Jackal. These tapes offer a deeper insight into what creates the demand for weapons in the first place, and the effects that these weapons have on people, both civilians and militia fighters alike. Is the Jackal really a villain? Sure, he is a war profiteer who deals in selling, buying, and reselling arms to militia and insurgent groups in countries falling into civil war around the world. He's definitely not a hero, but if these wars didn't start in the first place, there wouldn't be a market for the Jackal to fill. What larger geopolitical forces are at play that are creating the circumstances for conflicts like this to arise? When we learned that the international press was largely ignoring this massive and still growing refugee crisis occurring, What does that say about the larger world's moral standing in the face of the suffering taking place at the hands of the UFLL and APR? Is the Jackal really the cause of this issue? What difference will killing him make? There are tons of arms dealers besides him in the country already. If he's gone, is it not reasonable to assume that someone or multiple people will take his place? You even interact with these arms dealers throughout the game yourself, and you even help take out his competition who ride around in armed motorcades running their lethal freight up and down the country. By the game's end, we almost have to conclude that the Jackal isn't the cause of this conflict, but a symptom of larger forces at play that we, the player, the Jackal, and even the UFLL, APR, and mercenary groups are powerless to affect in any meaningful way. It all just feels so hopeless, which is why, in my playthrough for this review, I opted for the battery ending. Whether the Jackal really lives or dies, I don't really care, but if helping the innocent escape to a hopefully safer place meant I had to die in the process, it's better if it were me, since there's no telling if the Jackal would really follow through with something like blowing himself up. If you couldn't tell, I really like this story thematically. It says a lot without really saying much, and it leaves you thinking more than if it were to have spoon-fed its ideas to you with messaging and moralizing. It gives you choices, but ultimately these choices all lead to similar conclusions. This might seem like a flaw, but in the larger lens of the overarching theme of the story, it is painfully consistent. This might ultimately be why Far Cry 2 doesn't get the same kind of recognition as its sequel, because Far Cry 2 is so much more ambiguous that almost anyone in the story, including yourself, could be argued as a villain, whereas Far Cry 2's immediate successor and predecessors are a lot clearer in the divide between the good and evil forces in their respective stories. Far Cry 2's ambiguity might even be a bit confusing for some people, especially those who didn't really pay attention to the games for their stories, like me when I first played it. Replaying Far Cry 2 for this video really allowed me the opportunity to take in this game's story in earnest, in a way I had never really felt inclined to before. Being so strict about only caring about the gameplay in the past, despite having an already deep-seated appreciation for this game from those experiences, really made for an overall detrimental experience than the one I had this time around. It gave weight to the choices I made in the game, despite the futility of those choices to affect the outcome. It's hard to believe, but thanks to paying closer attention to the story, I have a deeper appreciation for what Ubisoft were going for with it, and my opinion on this front has improved drastically as a direct result of the high-quality storytelling present here. In that long story discussion, I mentioned a mercenary group. These mercenaries, to varying degrees, also end up serving as part of a gameplay mechanic called the buddy system. Buddies are mercenaries you meet as the story progresses, with whom you can establish deeper relationships. Buddies can help provide alternative missions to those given to you by either the UFLL or the APR, and if you find yourself succumbing to an ambush, a buddy will come and save you, giving you a second chance to complete the mission without having to start again from your last save. This system has a permadeath consequence, so if they die, they're dead forever. Because of this, you have to be careful. I found myself in a situation where I accidentally undershot a grenade throw, and in my attempt to save my buddy from a couple of militia closing in on him, I ended up accidentally killing them all. Buddies will sometimes be downed, and you are given the choice to either save them by using one of your own morphine syrettes, let them die, or kill them. It didn't happen to me on this run, but on previous playthroughs of this game, I've had buddies downed enough times that their bodies were just giving out, and they were dying regardless of whatever I did. They will ask for more morphine only to ease the pain of their passing. It's ripped straight out of Saving Private Ryan, but when you lose buddies this way, it makes the war feel very real, especially if you've worked with this buddy for a while. Sure, there is immediately another buddy on deck to take their place, but the impact of that moment, knowing that you've lost one of your buddies forever in such an agonizing way, grounds you in a way few games did and really still do. As I previously mentioned, there is no shortage of missions you can do for the varying factions in the game. The formula might be predictable for those who are familiar with the cliches of Ubisoft open world game design. Go to this location marked on your map, blow this thing up. Or go to this location on the map, talk to your buddy who tells you to go to another location to collect something, kill someone, or blow something else up before going to the originally designated location to blow up or kill whatever target is there. Usually, these targets cannot be fast traveled to and are situated at locations that are far away or deceptively difficult to reach. While the journey can be fun and the open world is pretty to look at, I do have to concede the point that there is a certain level of fatigue that comes with Far Cry 2. Sometimes you just want to do the mission without having to traverse a long distance through areas and locales you've been to and seen several times already. Sometimes I found myself taking a job from the APR or UFLL, and the moment I saw the marker in my map, I thought that maybe I should take a break after imagining all the fighting, potential hiding, and vehicle swapping I would have to do just to reach the destination, let alone actually do the mission itself. I found that progression because of this was really slow. I'm all for solidly long, beefy games, but the fact that one mission in Far Cry 2, depending on how you play it, could be the length of some entire games says a lot about the kind of traversal issue present here. While I understand it's going for realism and survival, I also understand how people could find the prospect of checking their map to find their mission goal on the opposite side of their current location out of the way of fast travel points to seem insurmountably tedious. That being said, when I was in my element, really on a roll in the gameplay loop, I saw traveling as the medium between points of actions, kind of like time between plays in baseball or American football. The combat was so engaging that despite the amount of time spent traversing the expansive open world, the promise of the heart-pounding, exciting action that lay just on the other side of this journey was enough motivation to keep me going. Heck, there was even a sort of fun that came with figuring out how to most optimally traverse the map to make my travels as quick as possible by utilizing both shortcuts and fast travel points. There was a bit of strategy and risk versus reward that came with that added some spice to the game. But that is just me, of course, and I can't really say that the way I made up for traveling in this game is a sufficient argument against those who see the game's open world traversal as tedious. As I said before, the graphics blew my mind when I first saw the game. It looked like nothing I had seen before on that generation of consoles. Of course, my point of reference was pretty narrow, but I remain impressed these days. It really goes to show just how impressive a piece of kit the Xbox 360 really was. The shadows match the shape and movement of the leaves on the trees. This is something that the PS5 and Xbox Series X have trouble with now with current games. The lighting changes with the time of day based on the terrain and foliage, which must have been a very difficult thing to do in a time where ray tracing for lighting that we know today was impossible for consumer electronics at the time. There are also reflections of scenery in the waters when they are calm, including of vehicles and people on those vehicles. There are particle effects when things explode. A lot of objects in the environment, as I said before, have physics and are destructible. The grass huts in particular can have their roofs blown out by explosions, and unsturdy extensions to permanent buildings can be completely destroyed in the heat of action. Fires leave scorch marks on the ground where grass used to be, and I can go on. However, this comes at a cost. One of the things you will notice with my footage is that the game has a pretty obvious dither filter applied. This is one of the sacrifices that had to be made in order to get this running on the consoles at all back in the day. The frame rate is also a big killer. There were play sessions I had with this game where I was getting frame rates probably in the high teens. It almost looked like I was playing a Nintendo 64 game. The frame rate issue was inconsistent, though. Sometimes it was really bad, but other times it was very smooth with few frame drops. There was some frame stuttering, but nothing like it was when it was performing at its worst. It made me wonder if maybe my Xbox 360 itself is having issues with the game, rather than it being the game's issue exclusively. This could also be a possible explanation for why sometimes horrendous screen tearing would occur. Screen tearing happens fairly often normally when I'm playing the game, but the visual of the screen tearing is exacerbated when the frame rate is suffering as badly as it sometimes did. Even so, after all of this, despite how gorgeous this game looks, compromises were made in order to get it running on consoles. And while the Xbox hardware does have a respectable amount of grunt, it's clear that corners had to be cut in some instances. Obviously, the PC version is the way to go with the Far Cry games in general, since first-person shooters objectively play better with mouse and keyboard, but seeing it running on console is a sight that I think is getting rarer and rarer, especially when it's on authentic hardware. As I mentioned before, one of the side quests you are immediately introduced to is the search for the briefcases with the rough diamonds inside them. There are 221 of these cases, each with varying amounts of rough diamonds in them. Rough diamonds are the game's currency, and each briefcase has between 1 to 3 diamonds each. This creates a bit of a grand treasure hunt that, being the Sonic fan I am, I couldn't help but to compare the treasure hunting stages in the Sonic Adventure games to this. The main reason for this comparison is the fact that to find these briefcases scattered across this sprawling map is to use your GPS device. This device has a little green light on it, which will begin flashing once you start getting close to one of these briefcases. It's a game of hot and cold, not dissimilar to the radar system in the Sonic Adventure games. The main difference is that no matter how far from the briefcase you are, as long as the green light is flashing, if you turn and face the direction of the briefcase, a light will show a solid green. And once you're very close to the briefcase, you'll hear a little chiming sound. This is a pretty neat scavenger hunt and would definitely bring any aspiring completionist a lot to do and extend the playtime of the game tremendously. However, this gameplay mechanic isn't perfect. I found that there were some briefcases that were placed in areas that were extremely awkward to get to. Much of the time, these locations tended to be just out of reach on top of some kind of building or ruin. This calls for light platforming, which to say is awkward would be a gross understatement. Jumping is so heavy in this game, and the physics seem to actively work against you in the least realistic way imaginable. There are some places here where it seems fairly clear how the developers intended you to get on top of some of these buildings, but the platforming and the physics are so jank. More often than not, I found myself either using some weird alternative way to get on top of things, usually by awkwardly placing a vehicle somewhere in order to create my own makeshift platform that could give me a boost, or just giving up and leaving it behind. Seriously, anyone who ever complained about how weird or bad the platforming in Doom Eternal was has not tried to get the diamond briefcases in Far Cry 2. It doesn't help that there is a clear input delay for jumping, which I believe is deliberate, but then why make us platform if you're going to make jumping so strange? It's not like there is a particular mechanic or a ledge grab mechanic in the game to help, but since this did come out around the same time as Mirror's Edge, which changed the face of first-person platforming, I suppose I could give it the product of its time pass, but at the same time, that can only mean that this particular aspect of the game hasn't aged exactly gracefully. It isn't unplayable, but it is the biggest example of gameplay jank in Far Cry 2. The sound design for Far Cry 2 has some really high moments, but also some moments that are questionable and confusing even. First, with the positives. Every weapon in this game has its own unique sound. This might not sound exactly special, especially if you were around for the big AAA first-person shooter games of that time, but these days that kind of attention to detail has been lost. That's not necessarily to say that modern games of today are worse quality, but it was the kind of technical showcase that really was a holdover from games of the late 90s, pushing the boundaries of technology that AAA games became kind of known for a while. It kind of seems like they were really trying to take on the movie industry and show that they too could utilize teams of people from different professions, including sound and Foley engineers, to add to the realism and immersion of the art. Nowadays, first-person shooter games are more focused on the gameplay aspect of games, doing everything to give the players a good feeling experience, prioritizing higher frame rates above all else. It's not necessarily better or worse, but market conditions and consumer demands have changed the expectations and direction of the AAA industry as a result. This is all to say that going back to play a game like Far Cry 2, all of the weapons having different sound effects when firing them, to the point where you can even identify the weapons your enemies are using without even seeing them, gives the game an entirely different feel. It actually makes shooting feel less precise, but not in a bad gameplay kind of way, but more of hardcore survival kind of way. The sound of the wind and the rain are also fantastic, and I found that listening to the sounds of nature helped to offset the tension of even the most dire of situations. The music is also cool. There are a certain number of tracks that play while you explore around the world. Sometimes there's no music, but when you were driving, a nice mellow track inspired by world music, not exclusively of African origin, will play. This track will change when you come within a certain proximity to a militia outpost, which will play a more tense, foreboding track that suggests that someone might catch you if you are careless. And if they do catch you, the track turns into a straight, pulse-pounding one that won't stop until either the shooting does or nobody is left alive. Where the audio stumbles is with the voices in the game. The first is during cutscenes, where the majority of characters speak incredibly quickly with no real cadence or intonation of any kind. It's flat and fast, and can be incredibly difficult to follow, even with subtitles. I'm not sure if this was an oversight on the part of the developers or if it was due to some kind of limitation, but if you care a lot about the story, it can really serve as a bit of a barrier to understanding what exactly is going on, who is who, and what is motivating them. During the gameplay, the voices can also cause confusion. If you are sneaking around or hunting that last one or two enemies, they will sometimes talk to each other or to themselves, giving away their positions. While I can respect the audio mixing here for what it is, and perhaps this would be better with a surround sound system, the way it's implemented in stereo can be disorienting. Enemies who are far away will sound deceptively closer than they actually are, and sometimes it can be difficult to determine if they are higher or lower than you as a result. You might find yourself hunting around for these guys just for them to find you first in the process. Whenever this happened, I felt that it was less due to the survival aspect of the game and more due to deception on the part of the game's sound design. It isn't the worst thing ever, but it was something that did affect to varying degrees the gameplay experience in ways I don't think was intended, and in a slightly negative way. There is one note I have about the gunplay in Far Cry 2. For a console first-person shooter game, Far Cry 2 plays like the best of them. It is a great feeling game with some of the best FPS gameplay I've experienced on console. Back when I first got my 360, I went straight from this to Duke Nukem Forever, and, well, needless to say, my expectations for console first-person shooters was never the same after Far Cry 2. The difference between the kind of polish with this game as opposed to something like Duke Nukem Forever on Xbox 360 was night and day. That said, there is, as I alluded to, one minor problem I have with it. Because this is a console FPS game, that means your only means of being able to interact with the game is with a dual analog stick controller. This is a very imperfect way to control a game of this kind, and developers knew that back when they first developed the first proper console shooter games. They all had their own remedies to this problem, but in the 2010s, with the military shooter being far and away the standard for FPS games, using iron sights on your weapons would induce an aim assist. Sometimes your accuracy with an analog stick just can't give you the precision necessary to hit enemies, especially if you're in a pinch. Activating iron sights then will have the game snap your weapon right onto the enemy to make for a more accurate shot. This is where quickscoping in Call of Duty infamously came from. Far Cry 2, of course, implements the same aim assist system, but there is one problem. I found on occasion that there would be a very clear long lag between the moment when you enter iron sights to when the aim assist snaps you onto an enemy. The lag is usually about half a second or so, and It would sometimes even snap you to a blank space where an enemy was while you were trying to focus on a different one if you're sniping from a distance. This isn't to say that aim assist in this game is bad, but it makes me curious how this sort of issue got through. Maybe I'm nitpicking at this point, but I can't say that I'm not used to it or expect it after my several playthroughs of it over the last decade or so. But if it was one aspect of the gunplay that could have used a bit more polish, it would be the responsiveness and consistency of accuracy of the aim assist. I can't say how many hours exactly I've poured into Far Cry 2 since 2016, but I'm sure it's among my most played games of all time. I've always held Far Cry 2 as being one of my personal favorite games of all time because of its immersion and gameplay. Yet despite that, when revisiting it again for the first time in a couple of years and playing the story to completion, I was still skeptical. After all, I've played a lot of really great games since even my most recent revisit of the game. Would it still hold up? In fact, it did. I was genuinely surprised at just how predictably the game behaved. Even after so long, getting back into this was like riding a bike. Once the initial nostalgia and learning curve of using a controller for an FPS game wore off, I fell immediately back into my original rhythm, and it was like I never left. Nothing surprised me about this game except the quality of the story, and that was in a positive way. I always try to see things as they are as opposed to the way I want to see things. But even now, I can't help but to say that Far Cry 2 has easily retained its place in my mind as an occupant in the pantheon of one of my all-time favorite games. 16 years after putting out Far Cry 2, it's sad what has become of its publisher, Ubisoft. Ubisoft was an industry darling and worked for decades to earn its spot as one of the top developers in the AAA space. How they've fallen from grace in such a relatively short period of time just goes to show how volatile this industry can be. But it's not like it wasn't, at least in part, earned. Whether it be its internal dealings or the complacency expressed in the gameplay of its most recent releases, the monetization of those games, and especially mocking players for wanting to own what they pay for, the transition from being an audience favorite and critical darling to being something of a supervillain, using their influence within the mainstream media to silence criticism is shocking. Whether or not Ubisoft can survive the tailspin they find themselves in at this time late in 2024 remains to be seen, but luckily for us, we can still fall back on their legacy of software they've left for us over the decades they have been around. Far Cry 2 being among them. For me, as long as this game remains playable, whenever I revisit the game, I will make sure to bask in its attention to detail, in its gameplay, its presentation, and the thoughtfulness of its story and themes and overall creativity that fans of Ubisoft franchises yearn for the return of. Imperfect as it might be, I'll take them any day over something safe and unambitious. If it's anything Far Cry 2 has taught me in spirit, it's that even if the results are imperfect, taking the leap in an ambitious direction, whatever that may be, is sometimes worth the risk of mistakes made as a result. Far Cry 2 is a fantastic game, and while I know that many might disagree, and they are well in their right to, when I got this game in January 2016, a year that would end up being one of the worst for me even still now, it provided me with a much needed escapism. And for that fact, I have a deep appreciation. If you haven't played it in a while, and you can, or if you never have, give it a try. You might like what it has to offer. Keep retromaxing.